Take that noisy thing off the table already, Margaret. You're ruining the evening. My daughter-in-law snapped at me during our New Year's dinner, and what hurt the most wasn't the sharpness in Vanessa's voice. It was the silence that followed. No one told her to stop. No one reminded her that the woman she was speaking to had spent decades making every holiday magical for this family. Not even my son. I adjusted the small hearing aid behind my left ear with trembling fingers and forced a smile that felt steadier than my heartbeat. Outside the dining room windows, fireworks occasionally lit up the December sky above our quiet Ohio neighborhood, flashes of red and gold reflecting against the glass. Inside, the only thing louder than the ticking grandfather clock in the corner was the sound of my own humiliation settling into the empty spaces between us. I had spent 3 days preparing that dinner. 3 days chopping vegetables, simmering gravy, baking Ethan's favorite apple pie from the recipe he'd once begged me to make every New Year's Eve when he was a little boy with missing front teeth and endless curiosity. I polished the silverware by hand, unfolded the linen napkins I'd saved for special occasions, and carefully placed tiny party favors beside each plate. At 68 years old, traditions still mattered to me. Maybe because traditions were proof that love had existed somewhere in the middle of ordinary days. Vanessa sat at the head of the table beside Ethan, perfectly composed in a cream-colored sweater dress, her manicured fingers wrapped around a crystal wine glass. She sighed dramatically before glancing toward my hearing aid again. Honestly, she muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. It's buzzing all night. Can't she just turn it off for a few hours? My cheeks burned. The hearing aid had been giving me trouble all week. I'd ordered replacement batteries, but the shipment had been delayed after Christmas. I hadn't wanted to mention it. I hadn't wanted to become one more inconvenience people tolerated out of obligation. Ethan shifted in his chair. For a brief second, I waited for my son to say something, to remind his wife that hearing wasn't a luxury, that aging wasn't a character flaw. Instead, he stared down at his plate and quietly cut another piece of ham. Let's just move on, he said. Move on. As though dignity could simply be folded away like an unused napkin. Across the table, my 16-year-old granddaughter Lily lowered her fork. Her blue eyes moved between me and her parents, uncertainty clouding her expression. No one else spoke. The room smelled of rosemary, cinnamon, and roasted turkey, scents that had always meant comfort to me. Tonight, they made my stomach ache. I reached for my water glass carefully so no one would notice my hand trembling. I'm sorry, I said softly. I'll try to keep it from happening again. Vanessa offered a tight smile before returning to her conversation about vacation plans and home renovations. The discussion resumed as though nothing had happened. But something had happened. Because sitting beneath the warm glow of holiday lights I'd untangled with arthritic fingers only 2 nights earlier, I realized this wasn't about a hearing aid. It wasn't about a faint buzzing sound. The truth settled quietly inside me, heavier than grief and colder than winter. The loudest thing at that table wasn't the device behind my ear. It was the silence of the people who should have defended me, and I had the unsettling feeling that this New Year's Eve was not the beginning of my humiliation. It was merely the first time I had finally stopped pretending not to hear it. After dessert, I carried the empty serving dishes into the kitchen with the same careful movements I had practiced for years, balancing porcelain plates against my hip while pretending not to notice how easily people forgot the hands that had spent a lifetime taking care of them. The laughter drifting from the dining room sounded distant now, as though I were listening through layers of glass instead of standing only a few feet away. I rinsed gravy from the silver serving spoon and stared out the small window above the sink. Snow had started falling again, soft flakes settling across the backyard where Ethan used to build crooked snowmen wrapped in my old scarves. He had loved New Year's Eve as a child. Every December 31st, he would race downstairs in footed pajamas and ask if staying awake until midnight officially made him grown up. I would laugh and tell him that growing older had very little to do with clocks and everything to do with kindness. Back then, he believed me. I dried my hands with a dish towel and glanced toward the refrigerator door where years of photographs had once covered every inch of white enamel. School portraits, family vacations, finger-painted cards from Lily. Most of them had disappeared after Vanessa moved in and remodeled the kitchen 3 years earlier. She said the clutter made the house look outdated. I told myself she simply preferred clean spaces. I told myself compromise was part of welcoming new family members. There had always been explanations ready whenever something precious quietly vanished. Christmas dinner became too overwhelming, so celebrations moved elsewhere. Mother's Day brunches conflicted with reservations Vanessa had already made. Birthday invitations arrived late or not at all because plans had changed unexpectedly. Small disappointments scattered across years like pebbles on a road, easy enough to ignore individually until one day you realized they had led you somewhere you never intended to go. I remembered the Thanksgiving Lily turned 12 and asked if I could teach her how to bake pecan pie the way my mother had taught me. Vanessa had smiled politely before explaining that Lily's schedule was simply too busy with extracurricular activities. 2 weeks later, I saw photographs online of Lily decorating holiday cookies with Vanessa's friends. I had pressed the little blue heart beneath each picture and commented that everything looked beautiful. I had become very skilled at gratitude for crumbs. A burst of laughter erupted from the living room, followed by Vanessa's voice describing a beach resort she wanted to visit in the spring. Ethan joined the conversation easily enough now. The uncomfortable silence from dinner had already been folded away and stored out of sight. Perhaps that was another thing people learn with age. Some memories lingered because they wounded. Others disappeared because remembering required courage. I walked into the pantry to put away unopened bags of dinner rolls and noticed the stack of carefully wrapped gifts I had brought for everyone earlier that afternoon. In all the commotion, no one had opened them. Ethan's favorite wool socks, a watercolor journal for Lily, gourmet coffee for Vanessa because she had once mentioned enjoying that particular brand. I ran my fingers across the ribbon tied around Lily's package and suddenly felt tired in a way sleep could not fix. The house remained warm. The holiday lights still glowed against the mantel. Fireworks would soon welcome another year. Yet standing there among canned goods and paper napkins, I understood something I had avoided admitting to myself for far too long. Loneliness was not always being physically alone. Sometimes it was standing in a room filled with people you loved and realizing they had slowly stopped seeing you at all. The countdown to midnight was less than an hour away when Lily quietly slipped into the pantry and closed the door behind her. The muffled sounds of conversation continued from the living room, punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter and the distant crackle of fireworks echoing across the neighborhood. For a moment, neither of us said anything. She stood there in her oversized cream-colored sweater, twisting the silver ring on her finger the way she always did when she was nervous. At 16, Lily had inherited Ethan's blue eyes, but none of his talent for pretending everything was fine. "Grandma," she said softly, lowering her voice even further, "are you okay?" It was such a simple question, for ordinary words, yet they settled heavily in my chest because no one else had asked me that all evening. I forced a smile that felt familiar by now. "Of course I am, sweetheart," I replied. "Families get stressed during the holidays." Lily glanced toward the pantry door before looking back at me. "That is not what I mean." I folded the dish towel in my hands with deliberate care. "What do you mean?" She hesitated long enough for me to notice the uncertainty flickering across her face. Then she exhaled. "I heard Mom talking on the phone a few days ago." My fingers stilled against the soft fabric. "Talking about what?" Lily lowered her eyes. "About you." I felt something tighten inside me, although I kept my voice steady. "People talk, Lily. It does not always mean anything." She shook her head immediately. "It was not like that." Her gaze lifted to meet mine. She said once everything was settled, things would finally be easier. She said you always complicated things because you still expected family traditions to matter. The pantry suddenly felt too warm. The scent of cinnamon and cloves lingering from dessert made the air thick in my lungs. "What exactly did she say?" I asked. Lily pressed her lips together. She said she was tired of arranging her life around someone who could not let go of the past. The words themselves were not cruel enough to make headlines. They were not dramatic. But sometimes the deepest cuts arrived wrapped in reasonable language. I looked down at the wrapped gifts stacked neatly beside me. "Did your father hear her say those things?" Lily nodded once. He did not disagree. I closed my eyes briefly. Somewhere beyond the walls of the pantry, someone turned on the television as cheerful hosts prepared America for the final countdown of the year. I remembered Ethan at Lily's age, bringing me wildflowers picked from the backyard and insisting I deserved them simply because I worked hard. I remembered scraped knees, science fair projects, piano recitals, and nights spent sitting beside his bed while fevers broke at dawn. Love had once been instinctive between us. Now understanding him required translation. Grandma, Lily whispered carefully, I do not think you are the problem. My throat tightened unexpectedly. I reached over and squeezed her hand. Thank you, I said. She looked as though she wanted to say more. Instead, she leaned against the pantry shelf and stared at the floor. I hate when people act like being older means your feelings matter less, she admitted quietly. You have always shown up for everyone. I looked at my granddaughter then and realized that while some people had stopped seeing me entirely, others had been paying attention all along. Outside, another burst of fireworks illuminated the snowy backyard beyond the kitchen windows. The new year was approaching whether we welcomed it or not. And standing beside Lily among forgotten gifts and canned goods, I began to suspect that the truth I had spent years avoiding was finally making itself impossible to ignore. After Lily returned to the living room, I remained in the pantry for another minute, my hand resting against the shelf where I had neatly arranged the extra dinner napkins earlier that afternoon. I could hear the familiar rhythm of my family's voices drifting through the house, conversations rising and falling with effortless ease, and I found myself wondering when exactly I had become someone they discussed rather than someone they included. The truth was, this evening had not created a fracture. It had only illuminated one that had been spreading quietly beneath the surface for years. I remembered the first Christmas after Ethan married Vanessa. She had suggested hosting dinner at their house because she wanted to establish traditions of her own. I had admired that. I arrived carrying my sweet potato casserole and homemade cranberry bread, only to discover the menu had changed completely. There was no room on the table for the dishes I had prepared. Vanessa apologized with a bright smile and explained that she had forgotten to mention the adjustments. I laughed softly and insisted it was no trouble. I drove home that night with untouched casserole dishes balanced carefully in my back seat, telling myself that flexibility was part of loving adult children. Then came Lily's 8th birthday party. I had spent 2 weeks knitting a pale blue cardigan with tiny pearl buttons because she had once told me it reminded her of something from a storybook. The party invitation arrived the day after the celebration had already taken place. Vanessa blamed a mailing error. Ethan sounded distracted when he apologized over the phone. I mailed the gift anyway, along with a handwritten note reminding Lily how deeply she was loved. There had been countless moments after that. Mother's Day brunches scheduled without mentioning the restaurant location until after the meal had ended. Family photographs posted online where I learned about gatherings only after they happened. Vacations discussed enthusiastically at Thanksgiving tables despite the fact that no one had thought to ask whether I wanted to come. Each incident had seemed too small to challenge on its own. One forgotten detail, one misunderstanding, one scheduling conflict. And perhaps that was what made it so effective. Pain rarely arrived all at once. More often, it accumulated quietly through repetition until it reshaped the landscape of your life. I thought about my late husband, Noah, and how he would have noticed the changes immediately. Noah had possessed an extraordinary sensitivity to small things. He remembered which flowers made me smile and which songs I hummed while washing dishes. He would squeeze my hand beneath restaurant tables whenever conversations became overwhelming and somehow knew exactly when I needed rescuing without making me feel incapable. Before he passed away 5 years earlier, he sat beside me on our back porch swing watching the sunset paint the Ohio sky shades of amber and rose. Promise me something, he had said. Do not spend your later years shrinking yourself just to make other people comfortable. I remembered laughing and teasing him for speaking like a philosopher after 40 years of marriage. He kissed my forehead and repeated himself anyway. At the time, I had dismissed it as one of Noah's sentimental observations. Standing there now beneath the pantry light, while distant fireworks crackled outside, I wondered if he had seen this possibility long before I did. Maybe love had sharpened his instincts. Maybe he understood that some people mistook kindness for permission to take without gratitude. I picked up Lily's unopened gift and traced my fingertips along the ribbon one final time before carrying it toward the living room. Midnight was approaching. The old year was preparing to leave quietly behind us. And for the first time in a very long while, I found myself asking whether surviving was the same thing as belonging, or whether I had spent years sacrificing pieces of myself in exchange for a seat at a table where my presence had slowly become optional. When I stepped back into the living room, The television hosts were enthusiastically announcing that there were only 20 minutes left before midnight. Champagne flutes caught the glow of string lights draped across the mantel, and someone had turned down the lamps to make the room feel festive. Ethan stood near the fireplace, scrolling through his phone, while Vanessa described an open-concept kitchen renovation she wanted to complete before summer. It struck me how naturally people could discuss future plans when they assumed everyone important would remain exactly where they had placed them. I settled into the armchair near the window and folded my hands in my lap. Lily took the seat beside me without hesitation. Across the room, Vanessa glanced in our direction before lowering her voice. It was subtle enough that most people would have missed it, but I had become fluent in small exclusions. "We really need to move forward this year," she said to Ethan. "We cannot keep putting things off because of guilt." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "Maybe this is not the right time." Vanessa released a soft sigh. "There is never going to be a perfect time." Her words drifted toward us in fragments between the laughter of television personalities and the distant boom of fireworks outside. I stared at the framed family photograph sitting on the bookshelf nearby. It had been taken 3 years earlier during Lily's middle school graduation. Ethan had his arm around Vanessa while Lily smiled brightly between them. I stood at the edge of the picture, slightly turned toward the group as though uncertain whether I belonged in the frame at all. At the time, I had simply been grateful to be included. Now I noticed how familiar that position felt. Lily leaned closer until her shoulder touched mine. "Grandma," she whispered carefully, "there is something else I should probably tell you." I kept my expression calm. "What is it, sweetheart?" She hesitated. "A few weeks ago, Mom and Dad were talking in the kitchen. They thought I was upstairs studying." My heartbeat slowed instead of quickened. Strange how repeated disappointments eventually taught your body to brace itself. What were they discussing? Lily lowered her gaze to her hands. "Mom said this house would solve a lot of problems if they could finally make practical decisions without worrying about hurting anyone's feelings." I looked toward Ethan instinctively. He laughed politely at something Vanessa had just said, unaware that his daughter was quietly unraveling conversations he had assumed remained private. "Did your father say anything?" I asked. Lily swallowed hard. "He said maybe you would understand eventually because you always wanted what was best for everyone." I closed my eyes briefly. Ethan had inherited Noah's gentle nature, but not always his courage. Sometimes kindness without courage simply became avoidance dressed in softer language. "I do not think Dad means to hurt people," Lily continued softly. "I just think he lets other people decide what is easier." I reached over and squeezed her hand. "You do not have to defend him," I said gently. "Loving someone and recognizing their flaws can exist at the same time." Lily blinked rapidly before nodding. On the television, the crowd in Times Square cheered beneath a shower of confetti from previous celebrations replayed in anticipation of midnight. The room around me remained warm and beautifully decorated. Vanilla candles flickered on side tables. The scent of pine drifted from the Christmas tree that still stood proudly in the corner. It would have looked like an ordinary family gathering to anyone peering through the windows from outside. Yet beneath the carefully arranged surface, I could feel something shifting. For years, I had mistaken endurance for peace. I had convinced myself that swallowing hurt preserved harmony. But sitting beside my granddaughter while listening to conversations built on convenience and practicality, I realized that people often called sacrifices reasonable when they expected someone else to make them. And for the first time in a very long while, I found myself wondering what would happen if I quietly stopped volunteering to be the person who always gave way. The final 10 minutes before midnight arrived with an almost theatrical sense of normalcy. Someone passed around sparkling cider for Lily and champagne for the adults. The television volume increased as the hosts interviewed cheerful strangers wrapped in winter coats beneath the bright lights of Times Square. Vanessa adjusted the throw pillows on the sofa with practiced precision while commenting on how refreshing it felt to begin the new year with a clear plan. I sat quietly in my armchair near the window, my fingers resting against the unopened gift box I had intended to give Ethan after dinner. It contained Noah's silver pocket watch, polished carefully and tucked inside navy velvet. I had planned to tell Ethan that his father used to carry it to every important milestone in his life. Job interviews. The day Ethan was born. Lily's baptism. Noah believed objects became meaningful because they witnessed love over time. But now I found myself hesitating. Some inheritances carried responsibility along with sentiment, and I was no longer certain my son understood the difference. My hearing aid released another faint buzz before settling back into silence. I adjusted it instinctively and noticed Vanessa watching me from across the room. She quickly looked away, but not before I caught the expression passing across her face. It was not anger. It was impatience. The kind reserved for delays in airport security lines or traffic jams on the interstate. A small inconvenience standing between someone and the future they preferred. Ethan crossed the room and finally stopped beside my chair. "Mom," he said softly, "are you doing all right?" The concern in his voice sounded genuine enough to stir old habits inside me. The reflex to reassure, to smooth rough edges, to protect him from discomfort even at my own expense. "I am fine," I replied. He nodded slowly before glancing toward Vanessa. "Good," he said. "I just wanted to make sure." There it was again. A bridge extended halfway across the river before retreating to safer ground. I looked up at my son and saw both the little boy who once slept curled against my shoulder after thunderstorms and the middle-aged man who had learned to mistake passivity for peacekeeping. "Ethan," I said quietly, "do you remember what your father always said about difficult conversations?" His brow furrowed. Then a flicker of recognition crossed his features. "That avoiding them does not make them disappear," he answered automatically. Noah had repeated that phrase throughout our marriage. Problems ignored in daylight only grew heavier after dark. Ethan offered a faint smile before his attention drifted toward Vanessa again. "Maybe we can all sit down soon and talk about some things," he said. "There are practical matters we should think through this year." Practical matters. The same words Lily had repeated earlier. I studied my son's face, searching for signs of urgency or malice and finding neither. What I found instead was uncertainty. He genuinely believed practicality and compassion could coexist without conflict if everyone remained reasonable enough. It occurred to me then that the most dangerous decisions were not always born from cruelty. Sometimes they emerged from convenience wrapped in good intentions. The television audience began counting backward from 60 seconds as confetti graphics floated across the screen. Lily hurried over and slipped her hand into mine without saying a word. Outside, snow continued drifting gently across the backyard Noah had loved so dearly. I remembered the final weeks before his passing, when he insisted on organizing every document in the study despite his exhaustion. He labeled folders in careful handwriting and asked me twice to promise I would never surrender my dignity in exchange for acceptance. At the time, I thought grief had made him overly cautious. Sitting beneath the glow of holiday lights while Ethan spoke of practical conversations and Vanessa watched the clock with restless anticipation, I began to wonder whether Noah had been preparing for more than his absence. Perhaps he had understood that love without boundaries invited entitlement. Perhaps he knew that one day I would have to choose between preserving everyone's comfort and protecting the quiet value of my own place in this world. And as the countdown reached its final moments, I realized I was no longer afraid of hearing truths I had spent years trying not to notice. Midnight arrived beneath a chorus of televised cheers and distant fireworks exploding beyond the snow-covered rooftops of our neighborhood. The glowing ball descended in Times Square as everyone in the living room counted backward in unison. 10, 9, 8. Lily squeezed my hand tighter with each number, while Vanessa leaned into Ethan with the effortless confidence of someone who believed the year ahead belonged entirely to her plans. 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year. Champagne glasses clinked together. Lily hugged me first, wrapping her arms around my shoulders with a sincerity that nearly unraveled the composure I had worked so hard to maintain throughout the evening. Ethan kissed Vanessa on the cheek before turning toward me with a tired smile. "Happy New Year, Mom," he said. "I hope this year brings good changes for everyone." Good changes. I studied my son's face beneath the warm glow of the Christmas lights. His expression carried genuine hope, yet underneath it lingered the same uncertainty I had noticed all evening. He wanted harmony without confrontation, solutions without discomfort. Vanessa reached for her glass and took a measured sip before setting it carefully on the coffee table. "Speaking of changes," she began, her tone bright enough to sound harmless. "Maybe this is actually the perfect opportunity to talk about simplifying certain things." Ethan shifted slightly beside her. "Vanessa, She placed a reassuring hand against his arm. I only mean practical conversations, Ethan. We have all been dancing around them for too long. The room grew quieter despite the television hosts continuing their celebrations in the background. I folded my hands together in my lap and waited. Years ago, I would have rushed to ease the tension. I would have changed the subject, offered more dessert, found a reason to disappear into the kitchen until everyone felt comfortable again. But Noah had once told me that silence could become a habit so strong it disguised itself as virtue. Vanessa smiled politely in my direction. Margaret, nobody wants you to misunderstand our intentions, she said. We just think it might be helpful to discuss what the future looks like. The house you live in is large for one person. Maintenance becomes harder as people get older. There are wonderful communities designed specifically for retirees, places with activities and support systems. Her voice remained calm, reasonable, thoughtfully measured. That was what made it so difficult to challenge. There were no raised voices now, no obvious cruelty, just carefully arranged practicality presented as compassion. Ethan rubbed his palms together before speaking. Mom, maybe we could explore options together. There is no pressure tonight. We just want to make sure everything is manageable for you. Lily's posture stiffened beside me. Grandma is managing just fine, she said quietly. Vanessa exhaled through her nose. Sweetheart, adults sometimes have conversations children do not fully understand. Lily looked directly at her mother. I understand more than you think. No one responded immediately. Snow continued drifting past the windows while confetti fluttered across television screens. I glanced toward the bookshelf where family photographs chronicled decades of birthdays, graduations, anniversaries, and ordinary afternoons. Noah's smiling face appeared in several frames, his eyes crinkled at the corners exactly as I remembered. Suddenly, I heard his voice as clearly as if he stood beside me once more. Do not spend your later years shrinking yourself just to make other people comfortable. I lifted my gaze and looked first at Ethan, then at Vanessa. My heartbeat remained steady. There was no anger rising inside me, only clarity. You are right about one thing, I said softly. The future deserves honest conversations. Vanessa relaxed almost imperceptibly, as though she had expected surrender disguised as cooperation. Ethan released a breath he had been holding. But as I sat there beneath twinkling holiday lights with Lily's hand resting over mine, I realized something profound had shifted inside me. For years, I had confused preserving relationships with preserving myself. I had believed love required endless accommodation. Yet entering this new year, I no longer felt responsible for making difficult truths easier for everyone else to ignore. And for the first time since Noah's passing, I found myself ready to stop apologizing simply for taking up space in the lives I had helped build. For a few seconds after I spoke, no one moved. The crackling sounds from the television filled the silence while confetti drifted across the screen and strangers celebrated fresh beginnings hundreds of miles away in New York City. Vanessa adjusted the bracelet around her wrist before offering me a smile polished enough to belong in a magazine advertisement. Of course, she said. That is all we are suggesting. Honest conversations. Ethan nodded quickly. Nobody is trying to pressure you, Mom. I looked at my son and wondered how many times throughout his life I had protected him from consequences simply because I loved him. I had stayed awake sewing costumes for school plays after working full days. I had refinanced our budget to help cover college textbooks without ever mentioning the sacrifices behind those decisions. Even after Noah passed away, I had continued insisting that Ethan focus on his own family instead of worrying about me. Somewhere along the way, my efforts to ease his burdens had convinced him that I would quietly absorb any discomfort placed before me. Lily remained beside my chair, her expression guarded. She glanced between her parents and me with the cautious awareness of someone witnessing a familiar pattern finally interrupted. Vanessa crossed one leg over the other and folded her hands neatly in her lap. You have to admit that maintaining a house becomes more complicated over time, she continued. There are responsibilities, expenses, emergencies. We just want to ensure you are taken care of. Taken care of. Such gentle words. I thought about all the phrases people used when discussing older adults without ever asking what those adults actually wanted. Safer options, easier arrangements, practical solutions. Sometimes concern and control arrived wearing remarkably similar clothing. I lowered my gaze to Noah's silver pocket watch resting inside its velvet box beside me. Earlier that evening, I had intended to place it in Ethan's hands as a symbol of trust and continuity. Instead, I found myself tracing the engraved initials with my thumb while remembering another conversation Noah and I had shared during the final months of his life. We had been sitting in his study surrounded by stacks of paperwork and legal documents he insisted on organizing despite his fatigue. I remember teasing him about his meticulous labeling system. He smiled and said, "Preparation is not pessimism, Margaret. It is love expressed through responsibility." At the time, I had rolled my eyes affectionately and handed him another folder. I trusted him completely and signed whatever he asked me to review because that was what 40 years of marriage looked like. Partnership, faith, mutual respect. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. "Maybe after the holidays, we could schedule visits to a few places," she suggested. "There are communities with beautiful amenities. Book clubs, fitness classes, people your own age." Lily's shoulders stiffened. Ethan stared at the carpet as though studying its pattern required his full concentration. I closed the velvet box gently before lifting my eyes to meet Vanessa's. There was no bitterness inside me. Surprisingly, there was not even anger. Only a growing certainty that I had mistaken silence for grace far too often. "You know," I said softly, "Noah believed preparation mattered very much." Ethan finally looked up. Something flickered across his expression at the mention of his father's name. "Dad always had a plan," he replied quietly. "He did," I answered, "especially when it came to protecting the people he loved." The room settled into another thoughtful silence. Outside, fresh snow continued covering sidewalks and bare tree branches in soft white layers. A new year had arrived while old assumptions remained suspended in the air around us. Vanessa's confidence seemed to falter for the briefest moment before she recovered with another practiced smile. Ethan shifted uneasily in his seat, and as I sat beneath the fading glow of holiday lights with Noah's pocket watch resting against my palm, I realized I was no longer afraid of disappointing people who had built expectations around my willingness to disappear. Some promises outlived the people who made them. Some acts of love were still unfolding long after goodbye. And for the first time that evening, I suspected Noah's careful preparations had not been about preparing me for loss. They had been preparing me for this exact conversation. The house grew quieter as the first hour of the new year settled around us. The excitement from the countdown faded into softer conversations and the occasional clink of glasses being gathered from coffee tables. Outside, the snowfall had slowed to a gentle drift beneath the porch lights, coating the neighborhood in a kind of stillness that always reminded me of fresh starts. I looked around the living room that had witnessed birthdays, report cards, holiday mornings, and tearful goodbyes over the years. The Christmas tree still shimmered in the corner, its ornaments carrying stories only I remembered completely. The handmade paper angel Ethan crafted in second grade. The tiny wooden rocking horse Noah bought during a road trip through Vermont. The glitter-covered snowflake Lily made in elementary school and insisted belonged front and center every December. Families were built from moments like these. Small offerings of love repeated faithfully over time. Perhaps that was why their unraveling hurt so deeply. Ethan finally sat down across from me, his shoulders heavy with the exhaustion of someone caught between competing versions of himself. Vanessa remained near the fireplace, arms folded loosely as if maintaining emotional distance would somehow preserve control of the evening. Lily never moved far from my side. Ethan cleared his throat before speaking. "Mom," he began carefully, "if anything we said tonight upset you, that was never our intention." I studied my son for a long moment. At 41 years old, traces of the little boy I raised still appeared unexpectedly in his expression. The slight crease between his brows when he worried. The nervous tapping of his fingertips against his knee. I loved him with the same fierce certainty I always had. Love, however, no longer required pretending. "I know you believe that," I said softly. "But intention and impact are not always the same thing." The room fell silent once more. Vanessa shifted her weight, but said nothing. Ethan lowered his gaze. "I just want everyone to be okay," he admitted quietly. "I know," I replied. "But wanting peace is different from protecting it." Noah had understood that distinction. He knew peace built upon one person's silence eventually demanded too high a price. I looked toward Lily, and smiled gently. "Thank you for seeing me tonight," I said. Tears filled her blue eyes instantly. "Grandma," she whispered, "I always see you." The sincerity in her voice nearly undid me. Not because I needed praise, but because recognition itself had become such a rare gift. I reached for Noah's pocket watch and finally held it out toward Ethan. He stared at the velvet box in surprise. "Your father carried this through every important season of his life," I told him. "He believed that time revealed who people truly were. Not during celebrations, not during easy years, but when kindness became inconvenient." Ethan accepted the watch with trembling hands. "I do not know if I deserve this," he said honestly. "Deserving is not the question," I answered. "The question is whether you will choose to become the kind of man your daughter learns courage from." Tears slipped down Ethan's cheeks before he quickly wiped them away. Vanessa looked toward the window, her expression unreadable for the first time all evening. I rose carefully from my chair and adjusted the hearing aid behind my ear. The faint buzz had disappeared hours ago. It struck me then how ironic that had been. The device everyone blamed for disrupting dinner had fallen silent long before midnight. The true noise had always come from avoidance, assumptions, and the expectation that love should require self-erasure. I slipped on my coat as Lily hurried to help me with the buttons. At the front door, I paused and glanced back one final time. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel defeated. I simply felt awake. "You confused kindness with dependence," I said quietly. "But they are not the same thing." Then I stepped outside into the crisp Ohio night, while fresh snow softened the world beneath my feet. Lily wrapped her arm through mine as we stood, together beneath a sky still bright from distant fireworks. The new year stretched before us uncertain and unwritten. I had not lost my voice that evening. I had found it. Sometimes the loudest thing in a family is not a hearing aid, an argument, or even silence. Sometimes it is the quiet moment a person finally decides that taking up space in the life they helped build is not something they need permission to do.